الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. Let's have another salawat, which inshallah will inspire the PowerPoint to come on the screen. So those were some excellent points. And I think also the talk we just heard from Sayyid Khabaz is a reminder of how many Shi'i scholars are taking an optimistic and proactive view of artificial intelligence. Of course, Muslims in general have a broad range of views. Some are hesitant about a new technology, where others are more optimistic about it. Some are pragmatic. But in general, we have seen, since artificial intelligence really came to center stage a couple years ago, that a lot of Shi'i scholars have been asking basically, how can we use it to do what we are doing better? And inshallah, we will be able to do that. So today we're going to be talking about a technology which, as Sheikh Alexander was saying, is related to artificial intelligence, has some similarities and differences in how it's panned out, and that is the internet. The internet is something all of us have some sort of history with. Many of us are in an age bracket when we can still remember our first time we encountered the internet. I was on the nerd program when I was a kid, so I encountered the internet a bit before a lot of other people. But I have to say, when the internet became a bit broader, and I got onto one of those big, now outdated services called America Online, I made the very quick and very astonishing discovery that there was an Islam chat room. Like, wow, because I'm living somewhere where there's just not much Muslim discussion at all, and all of a sudden you can go on this invisible highway and talk to other Muslims, just not too much because they used to charge by the minute and so forth. But the internet has changed a lot of our lives, and to some degree, I think it has changed worldviews and values. And I'm not going to say this is the same for everyone in every country, everywhere. We're all individuals and we have different circumstances. But I do think that the way the internet has become interrelated with many lives today has changed some of the way we see things. And so that's what I'd like to talk about today. A lot of times when we talk about the history of the internet, we talk just more about the technicalities, like how was it that the idea of a network was devised, but not so much about the ideas. And I'm going to be focusing on Islamic, ethical, and human ideals for today. Now, I know most of you probably can't read this because it's quite small, and we will break it down. But this is my history of the internet. And the dates on it are approximate, based on when, looking at various sources and even my own recollections, it seems like certain things became prominent, not necessarily when they were first invented. So for example, you take something like YouTube. Most people didn't use it when it first came out because they didn't have like a broadband connection, or they didn't have the time, or it just wasn't popular. But nowadays, YouTube is quite popular. Cryptocurrency, another one, when it came out, Bitcoin, for example, had practically no value. No one cared about it. And in our time, it has become an international phenomenon. So these are more dates of prevalence. And on the top is a general history of phenomena on the internet. And on the bottom is a Muslim history. And one of the things that we can see from this, and some of us might recall, is that when the internet first became a thing, which I've put that roughly before 1995, 90 to 95. It existed before that. But when it first came out, there was not a tremendous Muslim presence on the internet. We know it was primarily, first of all, run by men, and basically scientists, researchers, and government people, mostly in the West. That was who comprised the internet primarily at the beginning, and of course it is a different picture nowadays, but by and large it seems Muslims globally took a little bit longer to get past the digital divide and have more shared access to the internet, but we did get there. Just really, I think a few years after, most likely when you could start to get it through mobile or cell phones. But that is one difference with respect to artificial intelligence, that although the internet had a somewhat limited group of people who were developing it, coming up with the ideas and using it and populating it with the ideas, because the internet is nothing without us, right? It's not ChatGPT. Not yet, anyway. It doesn't just randomly spout out things. The internet is the sum total of what we human beings do on it. But in any case, that limited group took time to spread, including to Muslims. But with respect to artificial intelligence, there's been much less of a gap on all levels. Sayyid Khabbaz was talking primarily about the usage of the internet. So for example, how might we use it for religious education or research and so forth? But also we know although there were a good number of Muslims in science and tech back then when the internet came out, there are Muslims, both entrepreneurs and people working in technological research with respect to artificial intelligence. So we do have more of a share in the development of what's going on, not just being consumers of the technology, which I think that's a shift that should not be understated. I'm reminded of a sentiment from Sayyid Hossein Nasr a number of years ago. Keeping in mind this is dated. I'm not saying it's relevant now. Sorry, if you had an artificial intelligence up here, it wouldn't be dealing with human frailties. But he said that, in the earlier parts of the 20th century, or maybe even getting a bit close to the later parts, a lot of Muslims globally saw modern technological advancement as belonging to the West. So they were waiting for the West to come up with solutions like things to the environmental crisis. But I think we've gotten past that now, and we are part of the people who are developing these things, even though there is a certain emphasis on certain corporations. So that is a difference compared to this, where we do see it took time for us to catch up with what was going on online. So now, the olden days. Obviously, we're not going to be able to talk about everything regarding the internet, so what I would like to focus on a couple values that I find interesting. That although there was a limited usage of the internet in the early days, there was a strong value of freedom of information and non-monetization. Once it actually got out of government control, there was an ideal that the internet was not going to be a consumerist or commercialized place. Ha ha ha. Ha 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 ha. Didn't work out like that. But there was this ethos, which I think personally that is a very Islamic ethos. We're not forbidden from trade and making an income and so forth. But it could be argued that some of the values of consumerism and so forth have had a negative impact individually and globally. And I think that for those of us who remember the internet back in this time when it wasn't a place where you're trying to promote yourself, construct a self-image, promote your business, promote a product, make money, make bots to get people to buy your product, etc., there was a certain sincerity to it, and I do think that is an ideal that is worth considering. Now, I'm not saying it's bad to do online marketing. I'm sure some of you do, because that's how the world works. People buy and sell online nowadays. What I'm saying is I'm just putting it out here that it doesn't necessarily need to be all about selling yourself or selling a thing and so forth, but this ideal that there can be a sort of equalization of the human experience, which to some degree has happened. For example, even if we look at just Islamic literature, if you go back maybe 30 years ago or so, some of our books were very difficult to access, whether it was not being in a place where you had our source texts. For example, government censorship in some countries was a big problem, not allowing Shi'i tafsir and so forth. And nowadays, anyone who has a mobile phone can read our hadith books, our tafsir books, really any important books about Shi'ism. We have the major digital library softwares nowadays. So that is an ideal that actually has been actualized through many people carrying out a lot of work and making these things available to anyone who has an internet connection. And I think it's an ideal to keep in mind because I do think it's a very Islamic ideal, even though it somewhat fell apart once companies began to get into the internet and selling internet access, and then the bigger corporations came about, and now we have the big corporations that they say are ruling the world. At the same time, during this phase of commercialization, this seems to be when a lot more Muslims were getting online. And so here, this is like when the World Wide Web started to become more popular. If you remember back then, it was primarily text pages and images, but of course images took a long time to load. So I know for the very young people, it's amazing to think you couldn't just get videos and stuff on your phone. We're not in the video era yet. But for Muslims, this opened some new doors. For those of us who were living or are living in minority contexts, it did allow at least a sense of having support for who you are and what you believe, and to have a little bit more of a sense of an Islamic environment around you, even when there may be no one around you who is also a Muslim. Without having the internet to offer that at all, it was very different. And the same thing for being a Shi'i in a non-Shi'i environment. Muslims also took to da'wah online a lot, trying to convert people to Islam, or their preferred branch or view of Islam, and of course that is still done very vigorously. But one of the interesting outgrowths of this too is that less represented Muslim groups began to have more of a voice in Islam, and I would definitely include Shi'is. And this was alluded to previously in the morning session, but unfortunately many Muslims globally, and also many academics globally, have treated Shi'ism as an offshoot, there's a tendency to treat the majority as the real Muslims and Shi'is as the others. And the establishment of the internet allowed for various groups, including Shi'is, to actually have an authentic and a more equal voice. And of course, this definitely was strengthened by the Islamic media revolution, which came after this, which also allowed us to broadcast our views more equitably with what was out there. So that was a major shift in this time. And one of the other shifts in this time, some of you might recall, is once audio files became a thing, even though it might take hours to download your audio file, we could also share online Islamic media, especially majalis and ultamiya and stuff. And that was quite amazing to some people, especially in places where we didn't necessarily have access to a lot of ulama or a lot of religious programs. To be able to share this material globally did create a sort of link between the mu'mineen, which was greatly appreciated. And also, I think that's one of the reasons over time the level of dialogue in our community really has deepened in terms of the complexity of the topics that are discussed, just the average knowledge that young people have, for example. Even if sometimes we're pessimistic about it, it does tend to be much higher than it was in the past, where sometimes, this is a change that's gone over time, but sometimes the basics were new to people, especially even before this time. Then we get into Islamic media. And in general, as a Muslim, I'm trying to avoid categorizations of good and bad, because I don't think it's ever that simple. Most things have pros and cons. And I don't really want to classify any technology as inherently good or bad. On the other hand, being a human being, I have inherent biases, and so that slant will come out. But I would say in general, many Muslims, and especially many Shi'is, found the media boom, if you will, that's sort of all of the videos that have come on, for example, about Islamic topics, to be incredibly helpful. I mean, we're in a situation nowadays that sometimes if I want to just hear about something very obscure, I can look it up online, and I'll oftentimes find video content in English, which would not at all have been the case in the past. So this has been tremendously helpful to a lot of people. That said, something did come up that I would like to address, and that is what is known as the celebrity sheikh culture. No, mashallah, alhamdulillah, they're all celebrities. But what I am referring to is something we didn't really have in the past, to my knowledge. And that is, it seems like before the internet era, usually the ideal of your religious leader, the sheikh, is someone who's maybe a bit older, because with age, and inshallah, comes wisdom. And young people have wisdom sometimes, but even more wisdom. Someone learned, someone a bit self-effacing, like we look at Ayatollah Sistani and how many years he refused to take photos. Even now, there's very few photos of him. Yeah, and when the internet first did start spreading photos and having people on social media, you may remember a lot of ulama did not get on social media. You didn't find the Twitter account of Sayyid Khamenei, for example, and of course we didn't have Twitter back then. But I'm pointing out there was this sort of sense of the elder who's humble and not necessarily promoting themselves. Whereas with the celebrity sheikh culture, many people embraced younger religious representatives as, a bit like our equivalent of celebrities. I think you know what I'm talking about. And I'm not passing judgment on any of these people, but it does change it is a different value system, if you will, to be promoting youth, promoting people who, frankly, they look nice online. I mean, if your mujtahid lives in another country, you don't care what your mujtahid looks like. But realistically, being humans, we will share media from people who are a little bit, more aesthetically pleasing, not like a crooked nose and so forth. And again, a youthful appearance. And, some of this, again, has been good. But the treating of religious leaders as celebrities, some people would argue it is not necessarily in line with some of our deeper spiritual ideals. I did a stop and double take during Sheikh Vinay's lecture when he was talking about devotion to teachers. And I didn't have a chance to interrogate him in the panel exactly what he meant. But I started thinking about how vital that was as a value in the traditional Hausa system, because there are so many unwritten rules, if you will, that do form part of our religious and spiritual education and heritage. And definitely, there was a sense that there's a certain respect for your teacher and so forth, that it almost becomes part of your spiritual education in the same way we do find sometimes in other religions, also in the Sufi tradition as well. And I'm not saying that's not here anymore, but that is sometimes diluted if we're just getting information online and so forth. And so sometimes, there might be this tension between a celebrity culture, where people are being spread based on shares and likes and so forth, versus the spiritual aspect of devotion to one's, a spiritual leader whom one has faith in their teachings. I'm just putting this out there for consideration. There's pros and cons to all of this. And different things are sometimes appropriate for different times. I'm also commenting on some changes I've seen in my own lifetime. Alhamdulillah, I'm old enough to have seen all of these changes. Then we get into the social media era. Yeah, there was a time when there was no social media online. And again, as Muslims, this has had many impacts on us. I mean, I personally got onto Facebook just to keep up with Muslim events locally because they started advertising on Facebook. I'm like, what is this Facebook thing? I don't care. But, I made an account for that, and then we get into it, and then we don't get out of it. One of the things I personally started to notice during this time, and also in the development of Muslim chat forums, discussion forums, can I be the first person to say it here? Shia chat? Yeah, back in the day, which I was certainly not a moderator on. But in any case, one of the things I noticed is that just as the internet allowed for the presentation of more minority voices, we also started to have more women's voices, actually talking about what women are experiencing or questions or concerns. And I think that's probably because when you go back before the online period, usually the religious discussions didn't happen in an environment where women could easily participate or were encouraged to participate, or if you have a question, sometimes someone would hand you a piece of paper because the sisters are shy and they wouldn't ever ask a question, would they? So there wasn't necessarily an encouragement of that. But having everyone online, especially in a public forum like an online forum or a chat forum or a website, and certainly when we get to video and satellite TV, you don't necessarily have the same barriers, customs, and sensitivities that we have with respect to in-person presentations. And people who wouldn't necessarily be comfortable, say, having a woman standing here and addressing the audience, usually aren't that bothered to have a lady talking about tafsir on their iPhone. It's just a different vibe. And I think that, White said I'm not going to pass value judgments, but for me personally, I think it's refreshing to be able to hear what's going on with a large segment of the community, even if it's not necessarily, entirely a shared level of voice. It is a change, and I think that has been valuable. That said, there are other things that have happened that I do think, bring to mind some of our ethical values. One of them being that once we got on things like Facebook and you could start to count your number of friends and count numbers of likes and figure out that people like you more when you post photos of yourself and your dinner, and they're sometimes not bothered if you post about war and suffering and that sort of thing. Of course, some people are, but I'm just being cynical here. There was more of a focus on the self and being a little bit self-centered, especially as some of our interactions became a little bit more digitized. Yeah, I'm sure some of you might remember some of those cartoons when Facebook first came out, and we still see them nowadays, that, what if a person behaved in real life like they do on the internet? Here's my dinner. I did this today. It's broadcasting about ourselves. It's not dialogue, whereas communication is inherently a two-way street, or sometimes multiple people, like right now there's many of us together. But it's a sense of a single person largely talking about themselves and leading to this culture of self-promotion and leading to that being an ideal. Nowadays, many people will say you have to professionally develop your online image and market yourself. And again, I'm not necessarily saying that's bad, because it's the world we live in and the ocean we swim in, but I'm saying it's worthy of thought. And if we feel that this is the right thing we need to do, to ask, to be cognizant of it, to ask what are we doing, why are we doing it, and to be aware of the world we live in. I think that's what's important, rather than just getting pulled along by it. It's around this time that I think Muslims did worldwide begin to cross the digital divide, because you might recall that even when social media started coming out, it was still predominantly people in the West who were online and shaping the online world. But that began to change, and incidentally, with respect to Islam, and Muslims, one of the things that did change it was the non-English language support online, which got better and better over time. So, for example, you can use the internet in Arabic nowadays, you can search in Arabic, you can search the Quran in Arabic, and so forth. These things weren't there in the past. So, we move on to relatively recent times. And this is really when the internet becomes a corporate sort of thing. And it's, on the one hand, we've got these giant, if I may, world-ruling corporations. I'm allowed to say them, they're not taboo words. Google, Amazon, and so forth, that have a tremendous amount of literal power in the world, especially Google. Although sometimes we feel like we are in control when we're using Google, the moment you use their search, they are also putting things into your head. So for example, if as a Muslim I type, "Are Muslims allowed to eat shrimp?" there are certain answers that are going to come up for many reasons. And some of these answers are going to be more representative of certain agendas than others. We sort of have the illusion that these things are just factual, and while we can find out many facts online, there are also biases and preferences, which I think is one reason why the Salafi voice is so dominant in online media. In terms of funding and other forms of exposure, it tends to, if you're not giving Google search, for example, any other guidance, it does tend to be predominant, and this shapes a lot of people's views about what Islam says worldwide, because they do a Google search, they look at what it says at the top, and they move on. So this is something to take into consideration, that the way these technologies work do affect us, and certainly with artificial intelligence, those of us who are using ChatGPT and who doesn't, there are certain biases with these technologies. As Sayyid Khabaz was saying, hopefully we can even the playing field a bit and make it a little bit more accurate or representative. But these are things that crept in, which people didn't expect. And that's when we get into the era of illusion. We start to enter a time, without necessarily realizing it, where things online are not as they actually are. It starts with people photoshopping their photos, and then influencers. Maybe someone wants to look famous, so they somehow get a big crowd of people in a photo. The angle your photo is taken. I mean, media was doing this for a long time, and propaganda has been around for, probably thousands of years. But people do not always track the illusions that are in front of them. And I did come across a psychological study once, which I'm still thinking about, which, they found that when people watch videos of things that we know are fictional, like Star Wars, even if we know it's fictional, on some level our brain will treat it as true because we've seen and heard it, and we've experienced it, if you will. And I'm not saying, therefore, we shouldn't watch fiction or we shouldn't have anything to do with it, but I think that's good to keep in mind. Given that fake videos, fake news is probably only going to keep multiplying now that we can do it so well. And that these things do have an impact on people, they have an impact on ourselves, and one has to be particularly on guard not to be swayed by illusions. And I think one of the problems is that, capitalism being what it is, we are encouraged to always put out illusions. That's what, I'm totally going to offend some of you, but that's what marketing is, essentially. You want to give people the illusion that your product is necessary or the best. And it totally may be, I mean, water, for example, excellent thing to have. I love to have clean, fresh, drinkable water, and there are many products that are useful, but I'm also being realistic that this is one of the underlying values that we have in our time, and one that does tie into the environmental situation we're facing, which we're going to be hearing about next. And then we get to the era of artificial intelligence. As I mentioned at the beginning, unlike at the beginning of the internet, this is a time when Muslims are much more involved in the development of artificial intelligence technologies compared to when the internet first began to gain steam. I would say we have some very practical concerns about artificial intelligence as Muslims. The way I've tended to see it, and of course this is a very broad generalization, is in the West, there's a lot of concerns about artificial intelligence that are more just sort of general fear of something new, sort of apocalyptic fears. Whereas Muslims in general, I think it's safe to say that there are some practical fears, which I think Alex was alluding to, and Sayyid Khabaz, even if they maybe didn't say it directly, how these technologies are used on the ground in ways that are harmful and destructive, whereas countries that are not at war aren't necessarily facing these sorts of things. While at the same time, there are a lot of ways that artificial intelligence can even the playing field, or that Muslims are seeing that artificial intelligence can be used to, that we hope, to try to make some things more equitable. And of course, that's always challenging because lore about intelligent machines throughout history has often had the message that they end up only serving the elite. And to some degree, we are seeing that, especially with military applications at present. While at the same time, even something that we're all familiar with now, like ChatGPT, one of the major ways it evens the playing field is it reduces the advantage to being a native English speaker. You know, through the accident of history, English has become a dominant language, especially in the academic field. And yeah, I do feel for someone, say, who's born in Malaysia, and they have to publish in English and present in English, and it's not their first language. It's not fair. And ChatGPT does help with bridging this divide. Also, I was speaking about the ideal that knowledge be disseminated equally online. ChatGPT can certainly help with that for people who don't have access, say, to university libraries, or like in America, you have interlibrary loan and so forth. So these are ways that it can be used to reduce inequalities between people, albeit that's a very complicated issue. So perhaps one of the most striking things about our time is the sense of globalization in all of these technologies. You know, that I know there's people in other countries right now who are watching this, who may contribute afterwards in some of the discussion. And although there is still a paradox, on the one hand, sometimes people get stuck in their bubbles online, and they only see the news and the media and the information that represents their own viewpoint, and it entrenches it. On the other hand, we are able to share others' experiences much more easily, and I do think that one of the main differences that, frankly, I never expected to see in my lifetime is the pro-Palestine movement. That there are so many people worldwide who are actually aware of what's been going on in Palestine for decades and who are calling it what it is, a genocide, and who are supporting it in very practical ways. I think that does have a lot to do with the type of information transfer we have nowadays. And also it's been observed the translation software too, because there's software that can unpack what some people are doing in propaganda videos in, you know, Israel, and some of the ugly things that are said that no one would have had any idea, most people wouldn't have had any idea about before. So I think that's actually been astonishing. And you know, I do think that leading to more truth globally is a value judgment, but is a good thing. So this in brief is a reflection on the development of internet, and in particular, a development of Muslims online, and a few of the values it's called into question, some ideals, some things to think about. And again, I'm not being prescriptive and saying this is bad or this is good necessarily, but just I think the important thing is to be aware. So, thank you very much.